Chapter 1 of A Birding on a Bronco by Florence A. Merriam. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Birding on a Bronco by Florence A. Merriam. Prefatory Note. The notes contained in this book were taken from March to May 1889 and from March to July 1894 at Twin Oaks in Southern California. Twin Oaks is the post office for the scattered ranch houses in a small valley at the foot of one of the Coast Ranges, 34 miles north of San Diego and 12 miles from the Pacific. As no collecting was done, there is doubt about the identity of a few species, and their names are left blank or questioned in the list of birds referred to in the text. In cases where the plumage of the two sexes is practically identical and only slight mention is made of the species, the sexes have sometimes been arbitrarily distinguished in the text. Several of the articles have appeared before, in somewhat different form, in the Auk, the Observer, and Our Animal Friends. All the others are published here for the first time. The illustrations are from drawings of birds and nests by Luis Agassiz Fuertes and from photographs taken in the valley, together with some of eucalyptus trees from Los Angeles, for the use of which I am indebted to the courtesy of Dr. B. E. Furnow, Chief of the Division of Forestry of the United States Department of Agriculture. In the preparation of the book I have been kindly assisted by Miss Isabel Eaton, and have received from my brother, Dr. C. Hart Merriam, untiring criticism and advice. Florence A. Merriam, Locust Grove, New York, July 15, 1896. Chapter 1. Our Valley. "Climb the mountain back of the house and you can see the Pacific," the ranchman told me with a gleam in his eye, and later, when I had done that, from the top of a peak at the foot of the valley he pointed out the distant blue mountains of Mexico. Then he gave me his daughter's saddle horse to use as long as I was his guest, that I might explore the valley and study its birds to the best advantage. Before coming to California, I had only known the birds of New York and Massachusetts, and so was filled with eager enthusiasm at thought of spending the migration and nesting season in a new bird world. I had no gun, but was armed with opera glass and notebook, and had Ridgway's manual to turn to in all my perplexities. Every morning, right after breakfast, my horse was brought to the door, and I set out to make the rounds of the valley. I rode till dinner time, getting acquainted with the migrants as they came from the south, and calling at the more distant nests on the way. After dinner I would take my camp stool and stroll through the oaks at the head of the valley for a quiet study of the nearer nests. Then once more my horse would be brought up for me to take a run before sunset, and at night I would identify my new birds and write up the notes of the day. What more could observer crave? The world was mine. I never spent a happier spring. The freedom and novelty of ranch life and the exhilaration of days spent in the saddle gave added zest to the delights of a new fauna. In my small valley circuit of 1.5 miles, I made the acquaintance of about 75 birds, and without resort to the gun was able to name 56 of them. My saddle horse, a white Bronco who went by the musical name of Canello, had been broken by a Mexican whose cruelty had tamed the wild blood in his veins and left him with a fear of all swarthy skins. Now he could be ridden bareback by the little girls, with only a rope noose around his nose, and was warranted to stand still before a flock of birds so long as there was grass to eat. He was to be relied on as a horse of ripe experience and mature judgment in matters of local danger. No power of bit or spur could induce him to set foot upon a piece of boggy land, and to give me confidence one of the ranchman's sons said, "Wherever I've killed a rattlesnake from him he'll shy for years," and went on to cite localities where a sudden violent lurch had nearly sent him over Canello's head. What greater recommendation could I wish? If the old horse had had any wayward impulses left, his Mexican bit would have subdued them. It would be impossible to use such an iron in the mouth of an Eastern horse. They say the Mexicans sometimes break horses' jaws with it. From the middle of the bit a flat bar of iron, 3/4 of an inch wide, extended back 4 inches, lying on the horse's tongue or sticking into the roof of his mouth, according to the use of the curb. There was no other rein. The bit alone weighed 16 ounces. The bridle, which came from Ensenada in Lower California, then the seat of a great gold excitement, was made of braided rawhide. It was all handwork. There was not a buckle about it. The leather quirt at the end of the reins was the only whip necessary. When I left the ranch, the bridle was presented to me, and it now hangs behind my study door, a proud trophy of my Western life, and one that is looked upon with mingled admiration and horror by Eastern horsemen. Canello and I soon became the best of friends. I found in him a valuable second, for, as I had anticipated, the birds were used to grazing horses, and were much less suspicious of an equestrian than a foot passenger, and he found in me a movable stake, constantly leading him to new grazing ground. For when there was a nest to watch, I simply hung the bridle over the pommel and let him eat, so getting free hands for opera glass and notebook. To be sure, there were slight causes of difference between us. He liked to watch birds in the high alfalfa under the sycamores, but when it came to standing still where the hot sun beat down through the brush and there was nothing to eat, his interest in ornithology flagged perceptibly. Then he sometimes carried the role of grazing horse too far, marching off to a fresh clump of grass out of sight of my nest at the most interesting moment, or when I was intently gazing through my glass at a rare bird, he would sometimes give a sudden kick at a horsefly, bobbing the glass out of range just as I was making out the character of the wing bars. From the ranch house, encircled by live oaks, the valley widened out and was covered with orchards and vineyards, enclosed by the low brush-grown ridges of the coast mountains. It was a veritable paradise for the indolent field student. With so much insect-producing verdure, birds were everywhere at all times. There were no long hours to sit waiting on a camp-stool, and only here and there a tree-top to sky the wandering birds. The only difficulty was to choose your intimates. Canello and I had our regular beat, down past the blooming quince and apricot orchard, along the brush-covered side of the valley where the migrants flocked, around the circle through a great vineyard in the middle of the valley, past a pond where the feathered settlers gathered to bathe, and so back home to the oaks again. I liked to start out in the freshness of the morning when the fog was breaking up into buff clouds over the mountains and drawing off in veils over the peaks. The brush we passed through was full of glistening spiders' webs, and in the open the grass was overlaid with disks of cobweb, flashing rainbow colors in the sun. As we loped gaily along down the curving road, a startled quail would call out, "Who are you, eh? Who are you, eh?" And another would cry, "Quit!" in sharp warning tones, while a pair would scud across the road like little hens, ahead of the horse, or perhaps a covey would start up and whir over the hillside. The sound of Canello's flying hoofs would often rouse a long-eared jackrabbit, who with long leaps would go bounding over the flowers to disappear in the brush. The narrow road wound through the dense bushy undergrowth, known as chaparral, and as Canello galloped round the sharp curves, I had to bend low under the sweeping branches, keeping alert for birds and animals, as well as Mexicans and Indians that we might meet. This corner of the valley was the mouth of Twin Oaks Canyon, and was a forest of brush alive with birds, and visited only by the children whose small schoolhouse stood beside the giant twin oak from which the valley post office was named. Flocks of migrating warblers were always to be found here. Flycatchers shot out at passing insects. Chewinks scratched among the dead leaves and flew up to sing in the branches. Insistent vireos cried, "Tu-whip, tu-whip, tu-whip, tu-wee," coming out in sight for a moment only to go hunting back into the impenetrable chaparral. Lazuli buntings sang their musical round. Blue jays, blue squawkers as they are here called, went screaming harshly through the thicket, and the clear ringing voice of the wren tit ran down the scale, now in the brush, now echoing from the boulder-strewn hills above. But the king of the chaparral was the great brown thrasher. His loud, rollicking song and careless, independent ways, so suggestive of his cousin the mockingbird, made him always a marked figure. There was one dense corner of the thicket where a thrasher lived, and I used to urge Canello through the tangle almost every morning for the pleasure of sharing his good spirits. He was not hard to find, big brown bird that he was, standing on the top of a bush as he shouted out boisterously, "Kick it now, shut up, Dorothy, Dorothy," or, calling a halt in his mad rhapsody, slowly drawled out, "Whoa no." After listening to such a tirade as this, it was pleasant to come to an opening in the brush and find a band of gentle yellow birds leaning over the blossoms of the white forget-me-nots. There were a great many hummingbirds in the chaparral, and at a certain point on the road I was several times attacked by one of